our text from Matthew's Gospel, Matthew chapter 2, is like being in the middle of a dream. There's all sorts of echoes and reflections from the past. There's all sorts of explanation of something going on right now. And there's all this fear and this concern and this anxiety and this weeping and the wailing and the pain of the murder of the infants. It sounds like a dream. It's like, in some ways, I don't know if you've ever been into a hall of mirrors, where you stand in one place and you see yourself or the room reflected, and you don't really know where you are, and all the images are bouncing left and right, and it's difficult to make sense of it. Like that movie from James Bond. Anybody else a James Bond fan here? The way that they repeat them every Christmas. And The Man with the Golden Gun, and the scene where James Bond is trying to find the villain from The Man of the Hill. Test your knowledge. Who's the villain from The Man with the Golden Gun? No? Scaramanga. Anyway, Scaramanga is hiding in this hall of mirrors, and James Bond has to go and find him. Anyway, he uses the mirrors eventually to knock his enemy off. The other thing that bounces around in my mind reading this is like standing near a large valley or a canyon, where just a simple word or a shouted a voice echoes and bounces off the walls. Anybody had that experience? And shouting out, and you just hear the echoes kind of diminishing but coming back to you, sounding just slightly different. This is what the text in Matthew sounds like to the readers who were from the Hebrew or the Jewish origins. There are so many echoes and reflections trying to figure out what's going on in here in this retelling of the account of the escape to Egypt. We need to understand a little bit of these echoes, these reflections, to make sense of what Matthew's trying to tell us. Either way, echoes, reflections, dreams, Matthew's trying to tell us a very important thing about who this Jesus really is. Matthew's Gospel is said to be both the most Jewish Gospel and the most anti-Jewish Gospel. It's full of Jewishness. Either way, more than any of the other Gospels, Matthew builds the bridge between the Old Testament, the ways and the practices and the customs of the old way of life, and the new community of Christians that is growing. And it's to this new community that the writer of the Gospel of Matthew is trying to communicate. He's trying to say, look, there are some reflections and some origins and some echoes of the past that you need to hold on to. And then later on through Matthew, he also says, look, there's some reflections and echoes from the past that you don't need to hold on to because Jesus has fulfilled those. So it's not very surprising that right here in the very earliest pages, the very earliest verses of Matthew's Gospel, that he reaches back into the Old Testament to give us some clues about who this Jesus really is. Clues of Jesus' identity. And I want to identify some of these echoes. Four echoes or reflections that Matthew is using to help us make sense of who this Jesus is. Firstly, there is the image of the child of God, the Son of God, in fact. And this Son of God going to or being in Egypt. Jesus here represents the nation. Time and time again in the Old Testament you'll see references to Israel as though God is saying, Israel is my child. And I love Israel like a parent loves a child. And I want to nurture Israel and grow Israel up and follow my ways, just as a parent would train and raise up a child. There's lots of reflections here to the origins of the nation of Israel. When Moses went back to Egypt, do you remember Moses was in Midian? He had run away because he had murdered somebody, and he was hiding, and God called him in the burning bush and said, go back to Egypt. And Moses said, but what will I say? Who are you? And what message are you going to send me with? And God says, Then you shall tell Pharaoh, this is what the Lord says, Israel is my firstborn son. Here in Matthew, we see Jesus being referred to as representing all Israel. He is the firstborn son in Egypt, going to Egypt. And that's why Matthew uses this quote from Hosea 11, which is an Old Testament prophet, who says, when Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. Can you see how Matthew is using the echoes and the reflections of this identity of the nation of Israel, all wrapped up in the person of Jesus? So that's the first one. The second one is the connection between Herod, the one who is out to destroy Jesus, and Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, who was out to enslave and keep the people of Israel in bondage. And he became so fearful that the people would grow in number that he told all the midwives in Egypt to kill all the firstborn sons and all of the sons of those of the Israelite people. But the midwives said no. It's a really interesting verse. For those who are nurses or midwives, it said the midwives feared God and didn't do what Pharaoh said. I love that. And they turned up late to the deliveries, just so that the babies were born and the Israelite women could take away their children and hide them. I'm going to come back to that because some of you will be remembering that there was a special Israelite woman who hid her child. But here we see this connection that Matthew is making between Pharaoh from the past and Herod in the present. Herod has been stirred up. He's angry. He's full of hate, and he's trying to manipulate the status quo to make sure that he holds on to power. And so he sends his soldiers into Bethlehem to kill all the children who are under the age of 2. Third reflection or echo in Matthew chapter 2. Jesus is being referred to and cast as Moses, the one sent to enact God's rescue mission. It's not a surprise that many of us who know the account of Moses' mother carefully sending Moses in a basket down the river to escape the clutches of Pharaoh. But it's much, much deeper than that. Moses needed protection from his mother from the murderous Pharaoh. Jesus needed protection from his father in hearing the message from the angel to be protected from Herod. And the pathway for Jesus' return from Egypt back into Israel is very familiar to Moses' return to take the salvation message to the people of Israel. Listen to this. In Exodus chapter 4, before Moses left Midian to go back to Israel, who were enslaved in Egypt, the Lord said to Moses, "Now return to Egypt, for those who wanted to kill you have died." Now compare these words to Matthew chapter 2. An angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph, who was in Egypt with his family, and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother back to the land of Israel, because those who are trying to kill the child are dead." It's quite an obvious echo, isn't it? Almost word for word, Matthew is borrowing from the story of Moses that the time for the message of salvation is now, and that the one who will bring this message is in this person of Jesus. And finally, number 4, the weeping of Rachel. This prophecy that is referred to here about Rachel's wailing and weeping for the children of Israel casts Israel's mind back to a time when they were taken into exile. It's many hundreds of years later, after Egypt, and Israel has been broken and fractured almost by civil war and had been separated into 2 kingdoms. The Assyrians and the Babylonians had come and conquered both nations, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and taken them off into exile. And a voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and weeping, for Israel's children were no more. Well, it's funny because Rachel's tomb is in Ramah. Rachel was known as the mother of the nation. Way back when, in the first establishment of who the people of Israel were, it was understood how Rachel was the mother of the nation. And her tomb is in this place called Ramah. And the people who left Israel to go on exile, to be deported, had to leave Jerusalem and walk through the town of Ramah, straight past the tomb of Rachel. As the children of Israel were being exported, taken away from the land into captivity, into bondage, into exile in Babylon. This prophecy from Jeremiah is reminding the readers of the Gospel of Matthew that the nation has been in bondage, that the children of Israel have been put into captivity and removed from the land, that there has been great wailing and great pain. Yes, in this incident in Matthew, because Herod has murdered innocent children, but all the way through history, there has been wailing and sorrow and pain in the heart of the mother of Israel. All of these echoes, and many more, by the way, but these are the most obvious ones, are being used by Matthew to show the early Christians that the nation of Israel, in fact, now all nations are in captivity. All nations like Israel have been enslaved in Egypt or held bondage in exile in Babylon, and that God has always sent a rescuer, and that is what God is doing right now, sending a rescuer. So here, once again, God is faithful. This story, this account of Jesus' very early life is an account of God's faithfulness in sending a rescuer. One who was like Moses, but one who would eclipse Moses. A rescue like that from the slavery of Egypt, but this time for all nations. A return to the covenant like that of the return from exile in Babylon, only this time to a new covenant, a new relationship with God, where God would write the law on their hearts, not on tablets of stone. Even so, with all of these reflections and echoes that Matthew is using to give us an identity of who Jesus really is, I'm still left with a real problem in this passage. This holy infant, this Jesus, this rescuer, needs to flee for his life. This one who is sent from God, this child who is God with us, needs to be protected from a madman and a despot in Herod. Directly because of within a direct consequence of this story, innocent children are murdered. It seems quite bizarre, and it still is really unsettling to me, that the arrival of God in flesh should, as it were, result in the murder of innocent children. Remember, the wise men go to Herod, and they go and they inquire, and they say, where is this one to be born king of the Jews? And so Herod gathers some of the scholars around, and they said, well, probably in Bethlehem. And so Herod says to the wise men, go to Bethlehem, and then come back and tell me when you find him. But they don't. They trick him and they leave. And so he becomes mad, he becomes angry, and he goes to kill the children. The rescuer of Israel becomes a refugee, and unimaginable atrocities happen in a small Israeli town. If we are honest, this is not an easy text to digest. It sticks in the throat. It gnaws at the mind. It pressurizes the faith. How can I believe in a God who lets these things happen? Have you heard that question before? I know I have. But here, I believe, is the point of the story. In all of this message that Matthew is trying to communicate to us, It's clear that the birth of Jesus, who is the Saviour of the world, is the presence of God in the darkness, in the suffering. That despots will still rage and nations will still be held in bondage, that innocents will still be murdered, and that those who commit these atrocities do so because of their own free will. The presence of God does not nullify our free will. The rescue of God does not mean that we are somehow let off the hook. We are still accountable for our actions. This story matters because it tells us the truth, the sometimes difficult truth that there are unjust rulers, that there is violence, that we suffer personal grief and personal pain. And there is the dehumanization of communities, of societies, of nations. But in the middle of all of this that we see in our newspapers from day to day, week in, week out, God is present. This is a terrible truth, one that requires those like us with faith to exercise this faith in the middle of this pain, in the middle of these atrocities. Contrary to many claims that God stands off at a distance, that God has neglected and walked away from this world, that there is no evidence of God because of all the bad things that happen, this story tells us that God sees, that God knows, that God registers every tear of every mother who mourns for her children, of every father trying desperately to provide a safe home for his family in the midst of displacement and chaos, and every community trying to rebuild out of the rubble of calamity. The message is clear. God is here. God's plan of rescue has begun. The tyrant does not have the final word. It's a cheery message for this time of Christmas, isn't it? It's a warmly reassuring time where we send each other nice cards, and there's glitter and there's tinsel and there's presents wrapped in nice bows. And it is nice to catch a break, isn't it, from the news of the world that we see every day, every week. This good cheer, this almost lukewarm spiritual sentiment. Jesus doesn't enter that world. Jesus doesn't enter the world of niceness and pleasantness. Jesus enters the world of a murderous madman who takes the lives of innocent children. This is our world. This is the world that we live in. A world so deeply in need of a saving God. But far more than that, in need of a saving God who would step into this world and take the form of a child, of total vulnerability, of this dependent infant, and experience it for himself. This is the good news of Matthew. This is the origins of the faith for which no one could have prepared in advance. So Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. In this world of pain and sin and war and famine, merry, happy? Well, why not? And why not make a New Year's resolution? Every time you hear of something that pains your heart, every young life that is taken by stupidity, drunkenness, or suicide, every image that you see of a refugee fleeing for their lives, of war-torn countries and nations on the brink of collapse, know that God is here, in the middle of it. And know that God sees, God knows, God experiences it and walks with us. God has begun his rescue. And because of Jesus, we might consider doing the unthinkable, rejoicing, being merry in God, being happy and knowing that we are blessed. And I want to conclude here with what Paul encourages the Philippian church to do. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again I say, rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. Do not worry about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Jesus Christ. Let's spend a moment in silence reflecting on the presence of God in our world.